Don't forget to register in Slido. And today we have the rock person in software testing. Please meet Rex Black. Rex, how are you?
I'm fine. I assume you call me a rock person in testing because of my
Yes.
Dwayne Johnson like physique. But regrettably, I do not have the magnificent Dwayne Johnson Polynesian skin tone, but I do my best.
Okay. How long you in profession?
Well, let's see. I got started as a developer in 1983 while I was in UCLA getting a computer science degree. I paid my way through college working as a programmer and as a system administrator and all around tech guy. Ended in software testing in the late 1980s, primarily focused on test automation, working on automating Unix testing using C and various scripting languages. And I've been in testing pretty much ever since. A lot of very technical testing tasks, test automations, stuff that is now referred to as DevOps or DevSecOps, but at that time was just normal what you did in testing. And most testers at that time did have a highly technical background, and so there were a lot of us who do be able to do automation, do programming, review code, and that kind of thing. And so worked for a few companies as a test professional. Worked on one company in Los Angeles uh, before I moved out here to Texas. It had interesting technology, but their business plan wasn't very good. Their business plan was take all the money that IBM would give them for outsourced development, which in the early 1990s wasn't a very good plan because IBM hit hard times. So I ended up moving to another company here in Texas that, again, had interesting technology, but maybe not the world's greatest business plan. And they also ran into difficulties. And in both cases, I got laid off. And so after I got laid off the second time in 1994, I decided if I was going to be out of work because of bad business decisions, I wanted those to be my own bad business decisions. And I've been running RBCS ever since, 26 years. And while we've had our ups and downs, like all small companies, we've never once missed payroll and never laid anyone off, not even now. So I feel pretty good about our ability to keep the company afloat.
Great story.
Yeah, it is very impressive age of experience. Why have you linked your professional life to testing? And doesn't it become boring sometimes? Have you ever wanted to quit?
Well, I do have a definition of how much money is enough. And when I get to that, I will not be confused about the need to continue working or not. So, yeah, I mean, but that's not so much boredom. That's just, recognizing that there is such a thing as enough money. You shouldn't continue to work after you have it. But no, I'm certainly not bored. I mean, right now I'm working on a couple of just fascinating projects, actually three very interesting projects as Tmmi assessment for a big pharmaceutical company. I can't mention their name due to non-disclosure reasons, but you've been hearing a lot about them lately. Um, and so the TMMI assessments are interesting, and then been doing those. I'm doing working as an expert witness on a enormous $180 million lawsuit, and crawling through all of the um, evidence and documentation and so forth of the testing that was done on that project. And it's an interesting exercise in software testing archaeology and anthropology. So it's very, very interesting. And also working on what is essentially an independent verification and validation organization that's overseeing work at an electronic health records company. Um, a very large electronic health records company. So get to spend a lot of time looking at what they're doing from a testing point of view and a DevOps point of view and a security point of view. Um, so no, I'm not bored. I mean, I had a thought yesterday as I was sitting listening to absolutely fantastic Jimi Hendrix song Gloria while I was going through doing my work, and I almost had to laugh and think, I'm getting paid to do this. I'm having way too much fun. Still getting paid to do it. So no, I'm definitely not bored.
You're telling us about your project, and I'm wondering, what do you consider as a success in software testing? For example, when you run some project, how do you define that testing there was successful or it wasn't successful?
Well, there are certain metrics that I tend to look at. One of the classic ones, of course, is defect detection effectiveness, right? What percentage of the defects were found by the testing effort? So I like to look at that. I like to also look at the efficiency. So using cost of quality to evaluate whether the testing organization was saving the company money, and they almost always do. Typical return on investment for testing that I've seen is about 800%. And then some subjective things that I would look at would include surveying the key stakeholders, testing stakeholders to make sure that they feel that they're getting the information that they need, because testing is, of course, an information producing activity. I want to look at coverage, and that really shouldn't be subjective. That should be objective. There should be a way of tracing every test back to the risk or user story or requirement or functional specification or whatever it was based on, and then evaluating whether every element of coverage that should have been achieved was achieved. That's another thing that's important to look at. And also, I like to be able to look at what the organization is doing from a risk mitigation point of view. Ideally, again, not in a purely qualitative way, but actually using traceability of tests and their results to the risks. So these are all things that I would evaluate in certain types of assessments to evaluate how successful the testing organization was. And of course, we can also approach it from a process point of view. I was focusing on measurements there. You can also look at from the process side, and that's where things like Cmmi come in and are helpful in measuring the maturity of the process. And especially when you get to the higher levels, level 4 and 5, looking at how well QA has been integrated into the entire life cycle, not just tacked onto the end of it.
Okay, let me ask you some provoke questions. A lot of people saying that the testings, as we know it, for example, for the last 20 years, is dying. So big companies say that they don't need the manual testers anymore. They would like to completely get rid of manual testers and replace manual testing by automated testing, AI, and things like that. What do you think about the future of the testing as we know it? I mean, manual testing, the skilled professional software tester.
Well, I mean, to some extent, this DevOps or DevSecOps stuff, as I really mentioned at the outset, is a return to the roots of software testing. I mean, if you look at the work that Boris Beiser did, that Glenford Myers did, those guys are effectively what we would call SDETs. And so there's a lot of focus on technical aspects in their work. And so I think a lot of what's happening with this idea of, looking at code complexity and code coverage and having a lot of automated tests, especially at the unit and the integration level, is really just a return to the best practices of testing as they existed in the 80s and 90s. I mean, I was doing a lot of automation that now would be considered just a typical kind of thing that you would do in a build and delivery pipeline of CI/CD. Now, we didn't have the horsepower, the computing horsepower to do the kind of rapid delivery that organizations are trying to do now. But certainly these ideas that are being repackaged as DevOps and shift left and all that, these have been around a long time. And in fact, I did a talk on those for Luxoft, one of their tech talks recently on exactly that topic. Now, the question of where this leaves the skilled professional tester with respect to manual testing is an important one. I mean, you could. I think that testers should be able to participate meaningfully in the creation of tests at all levels, from unit all the way up to system and acceptance. So definitely testers need to become more technical if they aren't already. Learn scripting, learn programming, be able to participate effectively in a design review, in a code review, in automation, all those kinds of things. But it's important to keep in mind that an automated test is an executable specification, right? You have specified in the test what the behavior of the system under test is supposed to be. So as such, any test that is automated is effectively verification, which leaves out the validation piece, right? So in testing, we always talk about that difference between verification on the one hand and validation on the other, right? Where verification is ensuring conformance to specifications, Phil Crosby's definition of quality. But validation is talking about fitness for use, fitness for purpose, J.M. Duran's definition of quality. And any approach to testing and delivering software that leaves out any human element, any hands-on testing by skilled professional testers and or by users to participate in the validation is at risk of missing things. And I suspect that this is a hot stove that a lot of organizations are just going to have to burn themselves on before they rediscover the value of skilled testers. One of the things that creates a problem for that is that there is a lot of manual testing that is not very well done and does not necessarily add a lot of value. And I think that's the thing when organizations have an experience with spending a lot of money on manual testing and not getting a lot of value out of it for various reasons, that sours them on manual testing and leads them to say this, oh, heck with it, we're just going to go totally automated.
What about your personal key to success? Can you share as a secret, maybe in personal and in professional life?
Well, I would say that in my personal life, I mentioned putting myself through UCLA, and that was really valuable to get that degree, and I learned a lot. The other thing that I got at UCLA was I met my wife, and I got married, and that was certainly the best decision of my life. Hopefully she thinks the same. you never know. And there are times when I'd be afraid to ask her that question, but yeah, that's been, having a stable family is definitely is helpful. There's wisdom to that line from, I forget where this is in the Old Testament about man should not live alone. It's definitely good to have the stabilizing force. In terms of the professional stuff, professional success, I mean, I've said I've been able to keep my business going 26 years, and I said, I'm proud of that. Unfortunately, that's not because I'm a particularly great salesperson. So I think if I were a really good salesperson, I wouldn't be talking to you now, because I would have in one of the various internet or tech booms of the past, I would have managed to earn quote unquote enough money, and then I'd be retired. But one of the things that I have found is that I have a capacity for working very hard, and when I have when I've faced challenges, what I've done is just keep working harder and keep looking for more opportunities, and just try to you know power my way through it, I guess. So I know there's people that like to talk about, what was it, like a 20-hour work week and so forth. Like, yeah, right. If I had tried to live that kind of lifestyle, and my business would have collapsed years ago. So I think that there are people who get lucky and get rich without hard work, but I think 9 times out of 10, professional success involves being willing to work hard and make a lot of personal sacrifices to do it.
You've told that manual testing doesn't give the value to the companies, and I would like to ask, now context-driven testing becomes more and more popular. And how do you think, what advantages does formal ways of
Techniques.
testing give to the companies, or what advantages context testing gives to companies, and what is better in nowadays, in our situation now?
Well, so first, let me just kind of take on this whole context-driven testing and this idea of schools of testing. For one thing, context-driven testing is always, to me, just seemed like a complete statement of the obvious. I mean, of course, the particulars of a project, of a product, of an industry, of the risks that are actually out there that are associated with the product that you're dealing with. I mean, all of these are factors that everybody's going to have to consider, right? So this whole idea that there's some select group of testers who are uniquely sensitive to context, and that makes that, and somehow they differentiate themselves from the vast majority of testers, I think it's just silly. And I always have thought it was silly. I always thought that idea of schools of testing was divisive and schismatic and completely artificial. So I reject that whole concept from the start. And in fact, if you go out onto the RBCS YouTube channel, there's actually a recording of me having a debate with Kem Kaner about this, where I was pushing back on this idea of schools of testing. And I've got a whole webinar where I talk about the fact that there are no schools of testing. What there are different strategies. And you employ different strategies in a blended way appropriate to, surprise, surprise, the context in which you're working. So that's the context-driven school side. I think it's a very clever marketing that actually did the testing profession a disservice. Have that idea floating around, and it seems to have been pretty thoroughly debunked. If you bring it up on Twitter right at this point in time, you'll get pretty negative reaction to it. So I think people have realized that was not helpful. Now, in terms of the formal techniques, if what people translate context-driven testing into is, I can just test whatever I want. I don't need to write anything down. I don't need to keep track of what I've covered and what I haven't. I don't need to document my defects. I don't need to follow any sort of script other than, and when I say script, I'm not talking scripted testing. I mean any sort of plan, any sort of form of organization other than what pops into my head at any given moment. That's just, to me, that's just a recipe for disaster, right? I mean, and let me give you an example of how badly that can turn out. I was, previous to the case that I'm serving as an expert witness on now, I was an expert witness on another matter where So a developer put an or operator in an if statement where he or she should have used an and. Okay, very, very simple defect, right? And I was brought in. Well, what ended up happening is that caused a failure where a number of people were identified as being on the Treasury Department's what's called OFAC list, which is a list of terrorists and major narco traffickers. And those people didn't like that happened, and they sued, right? And so I was brought in as an expert witness to look at this, and from a testing point of view. And so what I found was that these folks had a testing strategy that they did have a documented strategy, but it was definitely not compliant with industry best practices, heavily reliant on a lot of just kind of exploratory types of testing, and not following a lot of formality, not following best practices with respect to using anonymized production data, et cetera. And then they couldn't even prove that they had followed their own strategy. And I was able to just tear them up in my report. It just, I basically just came at them and said, look, they clearly, this defect was easily found using known formal techniques such as decision tables. They didn't have testers that knew how to follow those techniques, apparently, or they just didn't bother to follow those techniques. They didn't even bother to follow their own substandard testing strategy. And as a result, they missed this defect. Cost the company $20 million. That's what they ended up losing in a lawsuit. So, if you're a tester and you're just playing loose on something, of course it matters what it is. I mean, if it's some app for a phone, right? And it doesn't do anything important, and nobody's ever going to get hurt, and there's no reputational risk and so forth, and you don't care if that goes out there and it has zero levels of quality, it's riven with defects and stuff, then if testing doesn't matter, then by all means test as if it didn't matter, right? But a lot of times it does matter. It does matter quite a bit. And that failing to apply proven best practices in black box and white box test design will lead to gaps in coverage, which will then lead to defects escaping into production. And somebody could get hurt, somebody could get killed, somebody's reputation could get damaged, tremendous amounts of money could get lost. So, I'm not, as you can tell, not a fan of people taking a lackadaisical or disorganized approach to testing. And the higher the risk, the more careful people need to be. That'll be the end of my rant.
Thank you.
Pretty interesting thoughts. Now we have both point of view. Okay, Rex, I know that you are doing a lot of consulting work, so I would like to ask you, what actually most of the customers expect from you when asking and hiring you as a consultant. But before, we are going to run a poll and would like to ask our audience what kind of problems software testing teams mostly have. So guys, please visit Slido. Please show poll results to the Rex. We are waiting for your answers, guys.
Yeah, I'm still seeing 0% for all of them.
Yes.
I have some pink, so waiting a little bit.
Maybe they have no problems.
Let me also vote.
This first one.
Maybe you should give them a while to vote, and then continue with the discussion and come back to it. People may need to think about it.
Yes.
What would you select, Rex?
Well, let's see. Let me see if I can read this list here. It's kind of small type. Problems with the software testing process. I see a lot of that. Problems with hiring experienced testers. Yeah, I see a lot of that. though I would say that it's not just any experience; it's the right kind of experience. Problems with proper testing approach and strategy selection, definitely a lot of that. Um, Problems with interaction between test and dev teams. Yeah, that comes in different flavors too. I see there's the problem where the test team either is placed into or assumes an adversarial role with respect to the dev team. And then there's the sort of benign neglect problem that can exist. Like I see this with a lot of problematic Agile implementations where they don't understand how to properly integrate the testers into the Agile teams. And either the testers don't get invited to major activities, or they get invited but they don't know how to participate. So that's definitely an important one. Problems with automation, yeah, it's definitely that's a major challenge. I do a lot of test automation consulting. As I said, I got my start as a test automator, and yeah, lots of organizations have really struggle with test automation. It's I like to tell my clients that it's riskier than open heart surgery, and should be approached that way, because if you look at the 5-year survival rates for open heart surgery, it's higher than the 5-year survival rate for the typical test automation approach. I mean, what the general rule of thumb that those of us who've done test automation consulting for any length of time have is that in the long run, and that would be 5 or more years, 50% or more of test automation efforts will fail. And with open heart surgery, the 5-year survival is more like 70%. So, it really, you need to take it very seriously. You're going to spend a lot of money on it, and it's really easy, and I see this a lot, to get a negative return on investment if you don't do it right. I did an assessment for a client a few years ago, a medical devices client, on their test automation, and demonstrated a positive return on investment for them. And my client contact was saying, like, are we making enough money? Is this good enough? Are we doing good enough? And I said, listen, any positive number for a test automation ROI is a good number. Obviously, the higher the better, but if you're getting positive return on investment, you're doing it right. So I definitely say that's one that would bubble towards the top of my list of challenges with that.
Okay, thanks. So let me switch off the pool.
So it looks like most people said proper testing approach and strategy, huh?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that feeds back into what we were talking about with regard to falling into that trap of seeing schools of testing rather than seeing strategies. I did, as I said, a presentation on this. It's a recorded webinar you can find on the RBCS YouTube channel that talks about all the different strategies. And it is fairly typical for organizations to omit important strategies that they could be using, or to overemphasize one strategy and underemphasize others that would give them more value. So yeah, that's a pretty common problem.
Seems that a lot of companies want to improve their testing processes or bring some automation, for example, or some new ideas, but they they aren't ready to change themselves. They aren't able to adapt somehow. Am I right? Have you ever met
yeah.
such issues, and how have you implemented the changes?
Well, there's an old line from Jerry Weinberg in his book Secrets of Consulting, and he said, no matter what it looks like at first, it's always a people problem. Now, I don't entirely agree with that. I mean, I think that's Weinberg. Weinberg had, I think, a strong background in psychology, so that's his strength. So he's going to want to emphasize that. Whereas you get an engineer geek like me coming in, and I'm like, show me metrics and show me numbers, and what are you measuring? But I think there is some truth in what Weinberg said, that in the projects where I've come in either as a consultant or working as a contract test manager or something, and when those projects got into serious trouble, there were always human elements to it, human components of the trouble. I'm reminded of a project that I worked on that unfortunately did not turn out successfully. And as it got towards the end, one of the project managers went from having a few drinks every single night to having a few drinks every single night and having a fresh bottle of vodka in his desk every morning. And that bottle would typically be empty by the end of the day. Having a raging alcoholic in a senior leadership position on a project that definitely doesn't help things. Now that's an extreme example, but yeah, I mean, a lot of organizations, they think something's going to be magic, right? And so the two kinds of magic that I run into most commonly are Agile / DevOps transformations and tooling, right? Somebody gets this idea, someone senior management gets this idea, hey, if we just do X, where X is adopt SAFe or adopt Scrum or go Agile, right? Or if we just buy this tool, or that tool can be Jira, or that tool can be a test automation tool, right? That's going to solve all our problems. And then they try that, and it doesn't, right? It doesn't solve their problems. And we have been falling into this trap as software development, software engineering professionals from the very, very beginning. Fred Brooks, the guy who wrote The Mythical Man Month, which is still, in my mind, required reading for anybody who wants to be at any kind of software development management position, including a software test manager, wrote this fantastic follow-up paper that I was required to read in my software engineering course at UCLA. It is probably the most memorable and most valuable thing that I read in my entire time at UCLA. And it's an essay called No Silver Bullets. And in that essay, Brooks said, look, there's two kinds of complexity in software engineering. There's artificial complexity and there's essential complexity. So an example of artificial complexity is where you use a programming language like assembly language rather than using a higher order language. And it makes things more complicated. It makes your life harder, right? The essential complexity is just that some challenges that you're trying to solve in software engineering are just hard, complex business processes and these sort of things. And there is no magic bullet that's going to make those easy and make those go away. Our collective failure as software development professionals to internalize the lessons of that essay, which remains true today, and to continually fall back into this magical thinking that if we just do X, all of our problems are going to go away, is really the root of a tremendous number of problems that we have in software engineering. I'm sure some people listening to me are old enough to remember, as I do, back at the dawn of object-oriented programming, where there was all this incredible hype about how great object-oriented programming is going to be, and all of our quality problems were going to go away because we would just have this big bag of Legos, effectively, of these pre-tested objects, and we'd snap them together and everything would be beautiful and simple. And that didn't work out. And Boris Beiser even talked about that in one of his books, where he made this joking reference to, he said this in Latin. I don't remember the exact Latin phrase, but it basically was the language will save us, right? And so now we haven't even fully given up on that, even though that's been disproven, because we keep seeing more and more languages popping up again and again. It's like, don't we have enough programming languages? Surely we have enough. And then the next thing that happened was that people got onto process, right? So you could argue that Cmmi and Agile are diametrically opposed, but I would argue that they are actually the same thing, in the sense that they are both assertions that get the process right and everything will be great, right? This is an idea borrowed from Deming and Duran and so forth, and I think what you find is that there are simply limits to how how well you can import ideas from manufacturing into software engineering and expect those ideas to translate directly. Um, we've been at Agile-ish types of development for 20 years now. I haven't seen any dramatic increase in the quality of software. Actually, to the contrary, I would say that it's as bad as it's ever been, in spite of the fact that we have considerably more technical horsepower that we could be harnessing to do thorough automated testing, for example. And similarly with the tooling, it's the same. It's that same magical thinking that we're going to do this one thing and it's going to fix all of our problems. Whereas really, it's just software engineering is hard. We are trying to solve hard problems. There are a lot of different things that we have to get right. Sure, we got to get the process right. Sure, we got to use the right tools. Sure, we've got to use the appropriate programming languages. But we have to just recognize that it is a difficult problem, that there are human elements to it, and approach it that way rather than approaching it with this magical thinking, which then, when it doesn't work out, leads to a lot of recriminations and negative dynamics within organizations.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, no silver bullets and no magic, but maybe for the
No
years
silver bullets,
in
no
the
magic.
industry, you have some best practices that you can share, or best practices that you are
Sure.
following in your work.
Sure. I mean, there are plenty of best practices in software testing. Now, one of the things I think that's important to point out, this phrase, best practices. Okay, there is a logical fallacy called the straw man fallacy, which is where somebody sets up an idea that is effectively a caricature of the actual idea, and then attacks the caricature, the straw man. That has happened with this phrase best practices for the last 20 years. The thing that people who like to mock the term best practices do is they say that best practices are recipes. And they're not. They're patterns. And the distinction that I make there is this: a recipe. If I give you a recipe for something I like to make, I like to make a pork curry, for example. Okay, so I give you a recipe. Here's my recipe for pork curry. And it's this much curry paste, this much kaffir lime leaves, and coconut milk, and pork, and et cetera, et cetera. And you follow that recipe exactly the way I wrote it down. You will get exactly the same thing, right? There's a whole point of recipes and cooking according to a recipe is to reduce variation and produce the same result over and over again, right? Particularly if you're running a restaurant, you're a professional chef, right? The same dish should taste the same one night after the other. That doesn't work in software because it leaves out the contextual elements that we were discussing before, right? You can't do exactly the same thing from one project to the next. But there are patterns that you can follow. So, for example, one of my clients is in the logistics business, and at least in many countries, like the United States, they have this rule that says when you're driving a route, you want to minimize left turns and maximize right turns. And the reason they have that rule is because a left turn tends to involve sitting idled, stopped, waiting for traffic to clear before you can make that turn. And also, you're more likely to get in an accident. So it's riskier and it's less efficient than a right turn. Now, of course, in the UK and in Australia and Japan and India, it's the reverse pattern, right? But it is actually the same pattern, right? Prefer the easy turn and the safer turn over the slower, harder, riskier turn, right? Now, how many different driving routes are there, given all the roads and all the locations to which one could drive on this planet? I mean, it's not an infinite number, but it's a huge number, right? But that pattern works on any route, right? It works in any route. Okay. So when I talk about test design techniques being best practices, things like state-based testing, pairwise testing, decision tables, boundary values, equivalence partitions, those are techniques that can be applied on any project. And it's very difficult for me to understand how anyone could argue against having testers know those techniques, know when to use those techniques, and use them consistently when they are applicable, right? That's a best practice. And there are a bunch of those kinds of things. And so it is a matter of some amount of frustration to me when I run into organizations where they're not utilizing these techniques because they've been out there so long, right? I mean, it's not. I've made this argument before. If we just did properly all of the things we already know how to do, I think the quality of software would improve by at least an order of magnitude. Again, I don't think we have all the solutions. I don't think we have made software engineering a true form of engineering yet, but best practices lead typical practices by a good 20 years in software engineering, and I think that's a problem that we really we need to address as a profession.
Mhm. Thanks. Rex, I know that you have impressive list of clients, and among your clients, there are a lot of clients from the regulated industries, such as medicine, automotive, aviation.
Yep.
How this regulation affects software testing?
So regulations are an interesting thing, and certainly the industries that you mentioned are regulated. But believe it or not, one of the more heavily regulated industries that is among my client list is gaming, video gaming. It's subjected to some fairly strict regulations that vary from one country to another, and they have to be very careful about content and presentation and so forth. So regulations are an interesting thing. They certainly make the testing tasks. Well, they require a great attention to detail with regard to those testing tasks that are related to the regulations, right? If you mess one of those up and release software that's in violation of a regulation, bad things can happen. I had a client tell me, this is a gaming client, tell me about a situation where they released software around the world that had this new character in it, and the new character, they had very carefully vetted the appearance of this character as a female character, and they thought they were in compliance with all regulations. Well, it turned out there was a rule in South Korea about how much hip could be visible, which, I guess that's a regulation. And they found out that the managing director of the South Korean branch of their company was going to be sent to jail if they didn't remove that character and change the appearance of that character immediately. So, the consequences of not testing adequately can be significant. It can, somebody can go to jail. I mean, obviously lawsuits are a strong possibility. There's the patient safety aspects associated with things like medical devices. So it raises the stakes for testing, but it also does something else that's interesting for testing, is it takes away arguments for shortcuts. Okay. So I have had clients that are in regulated industries tell me that they have been able to put a stop to discussions about schedule compression and budget cuts and all those sort of things by just saying, if you do that, we are going to release in violation of the regulations. and that's just the end of the discussion. There's no discussing about, well, maybe we'll get away with it or anything like that, right? I mean, everybody recognizes if we violate the regs, eventually we'll get caught. Now, it can be challenging to understand what exactly the regulations mean, as the South Korean incident points out. Especially when you're talking about regulations that have to do with content and so forth, but even with process regulations, documentation regulations, for example, with FDA regulations, there are certain evidentiary standards that have to be met. And so that does, it makes the testers and the test managers' jobs more challenging, because they really have to get their head around what the regulations mean and how to translate those into process, into documentation, and potentially, be able to convince an auditor that they've done what they need to do. So it's certainly a challenge.
Okay, let's imagine if you are able to get back anywhere in your past and change everything, anything that you want. Where would you go and what would you change?
I had no idea that question was coming. I hadn't had a chance to think about that one at all. Well, I mean, I think when I got, I mentioned that I started my company RBCS after I got caught up in a second layoff in a 2-year period, but due to bad business decisions made by my employers. At the time that happened, I was taking courses at UT San Antonio for a master's in business administration. I think if I had managed, if somehow or another I'd been able to, I don't know, magically improve the business prospects of my employer at the time, even though that wasn't my job. But if that had worked out differently, and I've gotten the MBA and then started my business, I think I would have been better equipped to attack some of the running a business problems that I've never been particularly good at. I'm not particularly good at finance, as I said, I'm not particularly good at sales. And as a result of not understanding those processes very well, I've not always had my head around what's going on from a financial point of view. And I've, in spite of trying 3 times to hire a salesperson for my company, been unable to do that. And if I had been able to successfully hire a salesperson for my company, then I think, as I said, you and I probably wouldn't be talking right now, because I'd be retired. So I guess that's probably from a purely professional point of view, the thing that could potentially have had the most impact was getting that MBA before starting my company. I think would have been advantageous in terms of finance and sales. And I think it also would have probably opened up a lot more areas of consulting that I could have done, and maybe broadened the company a bit, though not sure that makes a huge difference. We've had tremendous success in terms of having clients from across many different industries. So it's probably more just the finance and sales parts that would have been beneficial.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I wanted to ask about the critical testing process, and how does it differ, for example, from the Cmmi Next? What are the advantages of the critical testing process, and to what project can you recommend it?
Well, the critical testing process assessment framework is really different than, say, TMMI or TPI Next. It's It's metrics focused. Well, for one thing, it's a lot more coarse grained. It looks at processes at a higher level. Um, you have 12 process areas as opposed to 16 in Cmmi. It's got a lot less detail underneath those areas. It's more about using measurement. So it's really complementary to an organization. And TMMI is focused on process, and CTP is focused on measuring effectiveness, efficiency, and stakeholder satisfaction. So as such, that could really be applied in any situation where you have testing, a testing process that needs to be evaluated. It can be tweaked, customized in a lot of ways. So it can be, I've done a very broad focus looking across everything related to testing and quality in the entire organization, or it can be very narrowly focused on a single group. As for how it compares to TPI Next, as TPI Next, I'd say is similar to TMMI. I haven't really looked at it that closely, but it's I think there's 20 process areas if I remember correctly, and it's again fairly detailed. There are a lot of specific checkpoints involved. Again, TPI Next, I think mostly focusing on process, similar to TMMI. So again, it's a complementary thing. If an organization is using TPI as their framework, there could still be value in having us do a CTP assessment for them to look at, like from a pure measurement point of view, how effective are you, how efficient are you, how well are you satisfying your stakeholders.
Thank you.
Rex, I know that you are doing a lot of work in scope of TMMI. So could you please describe what actual value company could benefit of using TMMI?
Well, TMMI, of course, is a way of assessing maturity, test process maturity. So it really kind of breaks down into two separate groups. There's levels 2 and 3, which are about testing proper and improving the maturity of testing itself. And then there's levels 4 and 5, which are more about making sure that testing is fully integrated into the software development lifecycle and really is about improving quality overall. So what that provides, what TMMI provides, is a clear, prescriptive roadmap, a kind of here's how other organizations have reached certain level of implementation of best practices in the past. It does, of course, have to be adapted. There's an interesting write-up on the TMMI website about how to adapt TMMI in Agile development life cycles. So it's when I say prescriptive, sometimes people say, "Oh, prescriptive, that means it doesn't take context into account." Well, no, I mean that's not true. And if you read the TMMI framework, it actually does talk about how to adapt it and tailor it. But what it's providing is an example of, okay, these are steps that in other organizations, when followed, have led to improved testing processes. So, it's at the very least a useful and interesting set of ideas that a lot of different organizations can pick up and use. And, it also has that ability to be used as a way of benchmarking your organization against a proven standard and actually getting some potential marketing business benefits out of it.
Okay.
Rex, I've also heard that you work in military area, haven't you?
A little bit.
I don't know for sure, but it looks like military area is quite bureaucracy area. Uh, how is hard to bring something new to that area? For example, new ideas, approaches, methodologies.
Well, I never got a security clearance because it's kind of there's some interesting challenges to getting a security clearance here in the U.S. anyway. That in order to get a security clearance, you have to be on a project that requires a security clearance, and in order to get on a project that requires a security clearance, you have to have a security clearance. Now there is there's some sort of pathway in there, and I'm not quite sure about, but as a result, since I don't have a security clearance, there are kind of limits on the amount of work that I've been able to do with military organizations. But I would say characterizing them as bureaucratic, I don't know. One of our clients is the U.S. Air Force's Cyber Warfare Division. They're here in San Antonio. We've done a lot of training work with them. Again, limits on the amount of consulting work that can be done because of the classification issues. But I don't know that I would describe those guys as a bureaucratic bunch. Or, I mean, cyber warfare, pretty dynamic thing. Chief, some pretty interesting things those guys have, or at least they are alleged to have, right? Yeah. So I think that may not always be a fair characterization. Now, I think maybe one of the things that grows out of is the belief that in order to do work on military projects, that an organization has to achieve a certain CMMI level of maturity. And of course, CMMI has been associated with, bureaucracy and paperwork, right? So that may be where some of that image comes about. In some cases, it's just an attempt to organize an extremely complex process. So one of my clients has been, I haven't worked with them in a number of years, but I have worked with the U.S. Department of Defense's Joint Interoperability Test Command. And what these folks are responsible for doing is making sure that if, let's say, a Marine on a side of a hill calls in an airstrike by the Air Force to hit the enemy at the top of the hill, that the Marines' equipment actually effectively communicates to the Air Force's equipment, and that message gets through. Right? That's a very complicated problem to have to deal with because, modern battlefield is all highly computerized and everything is talking to everything else. And of course, it's quite dynamic. Clausewitz's famous phrase, "the fog of war," is not changed, and so, you're trying to solve a very complicated problem. Obviously, there's a fair amount of thought and process that has to go into making sure that you don't miss anything. So it's, again, similar to, say, safety critical medical device, right? You definitely want to make sure that the thing works before it's put into operation.
Good that you mentioned about TMMI and military. Don't you think that TMMI is best, for example, for the medicine, military, or some else big projects? But for small projects or for some startups, TMMI cannot be used because it's too complex and too many stuff should be implemented to reach next level. And it might be some extras that will kill testing because in small companies or in small project trying to implement TMMI, people will be focused on processes, maybe on some paperwork, but not on testing itself.
Well, we have to distinguish between TMMI as formal assessments and getting listed on the TMMI website on the one hand, which is for some organizations a worthwhile goal to have. and something that will help them achieve a level of formality of their processes that they need to try to put some structure around things that are highly complex and interconnected and make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. And on the other hand, you have the small startups, the organizations that you're mentioning, but they may not necessarily benefit from that type of thing, of the formal listing on the TMMI website, but they can certainly use TMMI framework as a source of useful and interesting ideas. If you look at the specific goals and the generic goals associated with the various levels, I mean, those are things, again, getting back to best practices, that are generally good ideas. And food for thought in any organization, regardless of the size, right? I mean, so should any organization look at defects that escape to production and ask the questions of, how did this defect get introduced in the first place? How did we fail to find it at any point in the testing process along the way? Right? What was the chain of events that led to this defect getting into production? How do we avoid that in the future? That's something that any organization should do, right? And I would say that it's organizational suicide to not do that. I mean, certainly as my company, when we have made mistakes, unfortunately they've been few and far between, at least in terms of major ones, but when we've made mistakes, we're always asking the question of, how do we make it so that never happens again? The first question we ask is, what do we do to make it right for our client that got affected by the mistake? And then the second question we ask is, how do we make sure that never happens again, right? So that's just a general best practice that all organizations should follow. And that's part of TMMI, right? So looking at the goals associated with the different process areas, looking at the different process areas and asking, well, what's the best way to achieve this goal and to implement this process in our organization, understanding that we need to keep it lightweight. That's the way that an organization such as what you described should approach TMMI.
Thanks. Rex, I think for past 25 years, people in software testing talking about test automation, and it's treated as a silver bullet. And I would say there are much more people involved into the test automation, and a lot of people moving from manual testing to the test automation. I know that you are doing a lot of consulting, and especially in test automation area. So I would like to ask you, what kind of problems a customer ask you to manage and to resolve regarding test automation? But before that, we are going to run a poll about the problems the teams have with test automation. Please show poll to the Rex.
So you have like hints.
Yes.
Loss of focus.
Guys, visit the Slido and vote. All of us have problems, especially in test automation, I think.
Yeah, I definitely like the not possible to see clear value. Excuse me. It's a good. It's an excellent point. This is the inability to properly measure the value that's being achieved from test automation is a classic problem with test automation. And I've long said that an essential part of a successful test automation process is the ability to demonstrate a return on investment, because without a return on investment, it's not a tool, it's a toy. And management will only let you play with the toy when times are good and there's a ton of money. So yeah, knowing how to measure the value is very important. And this is a general problem that organizations have with measuring value of testing. You don't always have clear goals. So if you don't start with clearly defined objectives and then translate those into metrics of success and then set goals for those metrics, the question of are we getting value from our testing is always, or our test automation is always a fuzzy one, and it's subjective, and that's not good, because a lot of the value of testing can easily be intangible if it's not carefully measured. So yeah, certainly I see that our high score now, unreasonably high expectations regarding test automation. Again, that's just the silver bullet problem. That's pretty much universal, that you will find in organizations that some number of people will have that mindset. Let's see, hard to hire people with the right mindset, technically skilled but focused on quality. Yeah. There's mindset and skills. The people involved in automation have to be about doing it in a way that again supports achieving clearly defined objectives, rather than just a bright shiny object that makes testing go faster. The great Dorothy Graham quote of automating chaos just gives you faster chaos, right? Loss of focus, quality technology. Yeah, I mean, I think that's just another aspect of the absence of clearly defined objectives, leading to a kind of just wandering around in the bright shiny objects of test automation and getting distracted by them, rather than clearly defining what you're setting out to accomplish in the first place. The lack of the approach, automating useless tests and neglecting important areas. That for sure. Yep. Automating something because it's easily automatable without considering the business value of automating it. I see a lot of that. Organizations need to have simple, easy criteria that they can use to evaluate a test and say, yes, this is practical to automate and also valuable to automate. And I've helped clients put those together. Focusing mostly on UI automation. Yet I see a lot of that. That's the so-called test automation snow cone, the inverted pyramid, where there's not a lot of automation down at the unit level or at the integration levels, but there's a lot at the system level through the UI, which is just really it's a bad practice. I mean, we talked about best practices. Yeah, the test automation pyramid, that is definitely a best practice, and you want to take that to heart. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the test automation pyramid is a metaphor, not a formula. I've had people say to me, "Oh, well, we're doing the test automation pyramid," and I'll say, "Well, how do you know?" They'll say, "Well, because we have," just making up numbers here, 100,000 automated unit tests and 10,000 automated integration tests and 1,000 automated system tests. So we're doing the pyramid. And then I'm like, wait a minute, you just compared test case counts across test levels without converting for size? I mean, you think about the number of lines of code covered by an automated unit test, right? What are we talking about? 40, 50, 100 lines of code, maybe, right? How many lines of code is covered by an automated system test? Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lines of code. And that's just looking at it from a line of code comparison, right? I mean, there's a number of different ways you could size a test. So my point is not that there's no meaningful way to compare. My point is that you can't pretend that you can compare test case counts across levels. So, but nonetheless, I mean, the key takeaway from Cohen's work on the pyramid is, focus most of your effort on getting automation down where it's fast and easily maintainable at the unit level, and do less of it at the system level. I think that's a really important point. Architectural problems, test development treated as a simple scripting instead of a complex development project. Yep. Yeah, I think it's interesting that that's the bottom of the list. I would actually I would put that higher on the list. I think I see a lot of that. So a classic example of this. I was approached at a conference by somebody, a QA manager, who told me that his boss had directed him to start doing a lot of test automation using this fancy new tool that he just heard of, Selenium, or Selenium, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Excuse me. And he told his boss told him, okay, you need to start automating all of your tests using Selenium. So right there, problem goal is 100% automation, which gets you into trouble because there are some tests that are not practical to automate or don't have value to automate, but that doesn't mean you should never run them at all manually. And then the fellow continued on and said, no, I'm not going to give any training to your staff to do the automation. I just want them to go watch YouTube videos, because there's apparently a lot of free YouTube videos out there on how to do Selenium automation, and that'll be enough. So that's a classic example of this. Test development is treated as a simple scripting exercise that anybody can do, and it's not. And you really do have to have some skilled senior people on the project to make sure that it doesn't make some of the classic mistakes. Because one of the things I would say, the question here, what kind of problems do teams have in test automation? One of the things that I've noticed is you get a lot of what could be called zombie automation projects, zombie test automation projects. The test automation project is dead. It just doesn't know it yet. They have turned into some kind of cul-de-sac, and they will never get out of it. So one of the things that I've seen, this is this classic test automation death spiral. You go in and you start looking at some metrics, and you find that the amount of effort associated with maintaining an existing test is approaching or now exceeds the amount of effort required to create a new test. At that point, you know that the test automation architecture and design is fatally flawed and unmaintainable. And the more people continue down that path, the more negative the return on investment is going to get. But because of the sunk cost fallacy, organizations are reluctant to kill a zombie test automation project the moment it becomes a zombie, and they continue to throw money at it, and then ultimately it fails, but it fails even bigger than it necessarily had to. So I would say that's a sort of a meta problem, if you will.
Thanks. I know we are limited by the time, so let's try to move to the questions from the chat. The first question is, why the testing should be incremental, or it should have a specific start and specific end? Please, up to 2 minutes per question.
Okay.
Guys, don't forget to ask your questions into the Slido.
So
Yes.
I would say, testing incremental versus sequential, it depends on the lifecycle model, right? I mean, if you're in Agile, you need to have an incremental approach. If you're sequential, then you're going to do a more sequential approach. So it's just really a matter of just properly integrating your test effort into the development lifecycle rather than treating it as this separate entity.
Okay. How do you come up with the number for enough money? Would you love to hear some of tips to plan for that?
Okay, well, actually, this is a fairly standard financial planning thing. What you have to do is figure out what your annual expenses are for whatever lifestyle you need to maintain, and then you figure out how much money you need to have to continue to sustain that lifestyle until you die. There are some assumptions that you have to make there, like when are you going to die, and so forth. And this is all stuff that you can look up online. Um, and then there are some fairly standard models, and as long as you don't run out of money before you die, then you have enough money. And so, in my mind, continuing to work beyond the point where you have enough money is a rather foolish thing to do. Um, but some people find work so fascinating and enjoyable that they probably will continue it even when they have enough money, and that's perfectly fine if that's your decision.
Okay. Speaking of testing techniques, is there an article or a book that tells us that if we do not use testing techniques, we have a lower coverage?
Well, so I mean, coverage. So coverage is kind of a multi-layered thing, right? So there's coverage in it from a documentation point of view. So I've got, say, in a test management or a task management tool, I've got some sort of specification, and I've linked it to a test, right? This could be a user story or what have you. So now I've got documentation of coverage, but then that still leaves open the question of, okay, I've asserted that this test addresses this specification element, but does it really? So then you have to look at how well does the test address that specification element. And that's a question of looking at the test and looking at things like the main flows and the alternative flows that exist in this piece of functionality, and the error flows as well, and making sure, okay, yeah, every one of those has been visited. And then even within those flows, there can be additional depths of coverage that you need to see. So, like, for example, in this expert witness work that I'm doing right now, we are seeing that the average number of tests for a use case, well, the median number of tests for a use case is 26. That's way more than the number of main and alternative flows. And the average is even higher than that due to the way that high numbers skew averages. So if you apply formal test design techniques, equivalence partitioning, boundary value analysis, decision tables, state diagrams, and pairwise testing, you will discover more interesting variations that are important to cover. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a higher coverage, lower coverage question. It's a better coverage, worse coverage question. You will get better coverage. You will have more perceptive and penetrating tests if you apply those formal techniques when you create them.
Thanks. Pretty interesting question about the Agile. Rex, do you see any need for test managers in the Agile age?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that needs to happen in a Agile setting is that the individual testers are put into the Agile teams. I believe this is the best way to do it. I've seen a number of my clients that do it this way, and it works. So this is why I'm saying I think it's the best way to do it. Testers are embedded within the Agile development teams, and on a purely day-to-day tactical basis, what they're doing is they're working as part of the whole team, participating in the daily stand-ups, reporting their results to the team, and so forth. But they still, from a sort of a matrixed organizational point of view, belong to a testing organization where the test manager of that organization is not responsible for their day-to-day tactical work assignments, but rather is looking at things like career development, skills development, things that need to be handled outside of the sprint teams, like, say, system integration testing or test automation or test data management, test environment management, things that are not good fits within a single team. And that test manager also serves as a potential escalation point if a particular team decides to do something that's really not a good idea from a quality point of view, then the testers need to be able to escalate to the test manager and say, "Hey, we have some dynamics going on within my team that are going to be a real problem from a testing and quality point of view, and I need your help to resolve them." So, absolutely, there's a place for test managers.
Okay, Rex, that's all questions from the chat. Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
I really
for having me.
enjoyed the interview with you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very proud that I can speak with you, and it's a big honor for me.
Wow,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you for this evening and for a nice talk. And I hope that everyone in chat and all people that will look the interview in the record now will know how to be a rock person in software testing.
I hope I provided some useful ideas to folks. Thanks for listening to me ramble and rant for 90 minutes, give or take.
Thank you.
Okay, see you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye, everybody.
Guys, don't forget to make a donation for our projects, and see you next time and next week. Bye.
Bye.